Thanks for having me. As Pat mentioned, this is a talk title that I came up with last week because I was in Frankfurt. Was anyone here in Frankfurt last week? There's a couple of us. There we go. So the next question you're not going to be able to answer. Postcards from Sibos 2025. How many of you know what Sibos is? A few. So literally 2 weeks ago, I'd never heard the term Sibos. And on Friday, I got sort of the nod to go. I booked a flight, which was the most expensive flight I've ever booked in my life, to go to Frankfurt on Sunday. I arrived on Monday, and I spent about 4 days at Sibos. And I very much felt like an interloper, so I call this Stranger in a Strange Land. I have some videos that are embedded in this just to sort of give everyone a flavor for it. But we'll talk a little bit about Sibos, but I thought I'd start out with a video that gives you a sense of what it's like. So if you guys could cue the first video.
It's also defense.
This is the CEO of Deutsche Bank.
Banks are called upon to actively shape the economic renewal of Europe. If we make the right decisions now, banks can become the driving force behind a new area of growth. And again, both for Germany, but even more so for Europe and for a globally connected economy. And the prerequisite for this is that we as banks are 100% robust and fully operational.
Okay, you get the vibe of it, right? Like very bankerly, very put together, a little stuffy, very professionally. But Sibos is the annual event of SWIFT. I'm sure everybody here knows what SWIFT is. It's the Society for Worldwide Interbank Financial Telecommunications, which is a bit of a mouthful. And it's a European entity. It's headquartered in Brussels. And it's a cooperative of more than 11,500 member institutions across more than 200 countries. And they support over 160 currencies. Okay? And it's the sort of thing that, at least in my world, and I'm of the crypto world, you're like, yeah, SWIFT, whatever, a bunch of banks do some stuff, old guy, whatever. And by the way, SWIFT was founded in the year that I was born, which is 1973. And so it's a 52-year-old consortium, but it's kind of a big one. Global GDP, total gross economic output across the entire world is about $105 trillion, give or take, a few pennies and cents in there. And SWIFT moves that every 3 days. Okay? So when we talk about scale, when we talk about volume, it's impossible to ignore the influence and the role of SWIFT. And being there for a few days, I was there as much to sort of put my finger on the pulse of this ecosystem and get how it, start to understand how it relates to our world. I very much felt that I was watching the operating system of the global economy. Okay? SWIFT is about as close as it gets. It's not a perfect analogy, but it's pretty close. And the analogy that I like to give is, if we think about computing as really consisting of 3 levels, and it's pretty easy to see in the world of cloud computing, you have a compute layer, CPU, you have a networking layer, data transport, and then you have a storage layer. Right? We're all pretty familiar with that. That without any question, SWIFT is the networking layer of the global economy. It's how these international banks communicate. Now, it's not the only way that they communicate. There's a bunch of other stuff going on, but it's by far the biggest and by far the most significant. Okay? Now, to complete the analogy, SWIFT is quite interesting in that it's only a messaging protocol. It's merely a way for banks to communicate with each other. It doesn't actually hold any assets, and it doesn't settle any assets. The assets settle at the central banks via things like RTGS, real-time gross settlement, and that you can think about as a storage layer. That's where the money actually lives. But what governs how the money moves is this thing called SWIFT. And it turns out that the global banking system is not particularly compute intensive, but it does very much depend on instruction sets. Okay? So just like you may be familiar with CPUs upgrade their instruction sets from like CISC to RISC, and basically it makes compute much more efficient. SWIFT is in the middle of a 20-year migration of its instruction set. Okay? So SWIFT was formed in 1973 to replace telex. So just think like one click above like a SOS, Morse code, right? It was telex. Well, telex was this totally informal system where banks could send each other messages, sort of like fax, but literally there was almost no standard to it. Like you just sort of say, hey bank, I'm gonna send you this, yada, yada, yada. And what Swift got together, it was originally about 500 banks. This is, we should kind of like make this a bit more formal, make this a bit more structured so we can be more efficient in our operations. And for a long time, actually, forever, they've used a messaging protocol called MT, which I should know what it stands for. There's a ton of acronyms in this space, but it was basically developed to govern interbank cross-border payment transfers back in the 70s. And there's an ISO standard about this, hasn't really evolved, but starting in about 2004, there's this new standard called ISO 20022. That's how they say it. Not 20,022, they say it a very specific way, 20022, which is an XML standard to basically provide much more expressive and much more explicit messaging and verification of messaging between banks. And this is basically an upgrade to the CPU layer, effectively, the instruction set, right, to make things more fluid, more flexible in interbank communications. But Swift itself is a quite interesting network. Now, before I started Blocknative, which was more than 7 years ago, I was an exec, and this is how I know Pat and Amy, at this little networking company called Cisco. Maybe you've heard of it, okay? And Cisco is a very big organization, and so I'm sort of always curious about things like network topology. Like, how does a network actually work? And how do you think Swift works? Like, really? Like, do a little bit of Gemini, Google, ChatGPT searching, and you realize it's actually totally a private network, works entirely over leased lines. You can get access to the Swift network via the public internet, but only over secure VPN. To connect, you need permission. You use basically proprietary hardware. There's special key management infrastructure, and to communicate over it is bidirectional opt-in. Like, Bank A can't communicate with Bank B without first getting authorization to send the message. So Swift today processes on the order of 40 to 50 million messages per day. It's about, I think, 500 to 600 TPS. And so it's a pretty robust system. And in its history, there haven't been very many breaches. The last major breach was at the Bank of Bangladesh, but it wasn't a breach of the network, it was a breach of that bank. And so it turns out that once you're sort of inside the bank, you can send authorized messages, and that was a big scare, and they upgraded a whole bunch of internal protocols around that. And that is Swift, right? And so when you look at Swift, which is the operating system of the global economy, I also feel like I was getting a glimpse into the fabric of reality. Like, oh, here's how it all really works, right? But it was sort of strange. There were these unfamiliar customs to me in crypto, like business cards. Everybody asked me for a business card, right? I was like, no, I don't have a business card, but like that was a big thing, was business cards. The attire, they wore these funny clothes, like everybody was in blue suits. By the way, this was on the show floor. This was kind of a little bit of a party, and it was hopping. The music was good. Everyone was vibing. For the Bank of Angola booth, right? The Angolan bank was basically throwing down the whole time, right on the main floor of the whole thing. Again, pretty interesting for me. And there's all this unfamiliar language, okay? Now, some of these may be familiar to you, like Pat talked about Mika and Genius, but like, anyone know what EMT is in this world? By the way, it's not an emergency medical technician. That's what's called an e-money token. Which if you're in this room, you're like, WTF, e-money token? I mean, hello, stablecoin? Hello, crypto? Like, no, EMT, e-money token. What's a ART? That's an asset reference token, which is a banking term for RWA, right? And so there's this whole other set of language. Now, there's all sorts of neat things in here. My favorite one that I learned while I was there was Nostro Vostro. Are you guys familiar with Nostro Vostro? Okay, you know where Nostro Vostro comes? So Nostro Vostro is Latin, and it was invented by this group of bankers known as the Medicis in the 1600s, okay? And nostro means ours, and vostro means yours. Okay? And so in correspondent banking, the way that international banking works, you have a bank that has balances on both sides that basically go through the work to set up and incorporate in the two jurisdictions that you're trying to bank. And remember, the banks don't hold the money, the central banks do. And so if you want to move money, let's say you're out on the bay, which I'll be hopefully later today wing foiling, and you're a wing foil retailer or manufacturer, and you have you have a fabrication plant, seamstresses in Vietnam, and you order $100,000 of wings that need to be sewn. You need to pay the Vietnamese. You use what's called the correspondent bank, of course, to move stuff back and forth. And the way the correspondent bank manages your accounts is you have balances there that are called nostro and vostro accounts. And so rather than move the money between these two central banks, they just debit your nostro account and they credit your vostro account on the other side, and the money, quote unquote, moves without anything actually changing hands. Now, why did the Medicis invent this? Because if you were doing nation-state level commerce in the 1600s and you needed to move value, you put bars of precious metals onto ships or carriages, which, as you might imagine, was relatively expensive and also quite insecure. And so to facilitate international commerce, the Medicis and others, of course, invented things like correspondent banking, where you would actually just park a bunch of precious assets at their bank, and they would handle the debits and credits for you so you could move goods and conduct commerce much more fairly, which, of course, had this really critical process, which is you trusted the bank not to repossess your assets, okay? So correspondent banking, international trade, has historically been based on trust. And we're all here in Web3 because we're saying, don't trust people, trust the math. This is trustware, this is trustless, all this sort of jazz. It goes right to the fabric of how all this stuff works. It's fascinating, okay? And so, anyways, I get sort of dropped in, parachute into this world of Sibos, this alternate reality, the sort of other side of the coin from the stuff I'm used to when I go to all the crypto stuff. And yet, this is what happens. This is the keynote, and so this is our second video. And so this is going to be Javier, who is the CEO of Swift. You guys ready with the second video? Go.
Today, I'm very pleased to announce that we will add a blockchain-based ledger to our technology infrastructure to allow for trusted movement of tokenized value across the digital ecosystems. Wow. And those opposites, Swift and blockchain, TradFi and DeFi, can they really go together? Well, in the regulated system in the future, we believe they can. Banks are ready for it, and they're asking us to play a bigger role.
Okay, that's a video clip. You can get it on YouTube or on Twitter. It's worth dissecting because the language is very precise and very specific. And on one level, you look at that and you go, hey, we won. Hey, they're coming on, like, we got it, right? But this is why I made this trip, was to really get a flavor of what's going on there. Now, first off, Swift historically, by the way, it's really easy to think this world is full of a bunch of dopes that don't see what's coming, and the truth is the opposite. These are super smart people, super aggressive, highly incentivized, very well paid, and they pay attention, right? So, like, do not be naive about the relative degree of sophistication of the TradFi world. They're really goddamn smart, okay? And two, they hate being talked about as the old stodgy dinosaurs who are about to get displaced, okay? They have egos as well. And so, there's a couple of interesting things here. A blockchain-based ledger to our technology infrastructure. So almost nobody, in my experience at Sibos, said the word on-chain. They all said DLT, okay? Which to me is this very weird thing, because we in crypto never talk about DLT. Like, DLT is just kind of the tech. Like, it's like the least interesting part. The most interesting part these guys don't talk about very much, or they don't talk about directly, okay? Two, here's another video. Sorry, one more to throw in here. This is Doran, who's an MIT economics professor and small thing Nobel Prize winner. You can play that one. This is the last video, I promise.
Trusted institutions could be a vehicle for pulling digital in the right direction, away from cryptocurrencies, which I think have no obvious benefit, but digital assets would have a lot of benefits. And I think this has to be planned, it has to be a very innovative process, but I'm glad you've sort of landed in the same place.
So crypto has no point, but digital assets. And literally, I'm sitting in the audience, I look around, I'm like, did anyone else hear that? Like, this guy is no, he's like a Nobel Prize winner, he's way smarter than me. But like, so they don't talk about crypto. And if they talk about crypto, it's in a negative context. But they talk a lot about digital assets. And you're like, guys, this is the same thing. Like, no, that word's a bad word. This word's okay. And now, there's that video. this was something very interesting. Pat talked about this briefly. There's a lot of talk about stablecoins, but in my experience, not a lot of understanding how they work. Now, I can't read this here, but this is the Circle documentation for where USDC, on which chains USDC is supported, right? So in 100% of the conversations I had and the panels and things I saw at Sibos, everybody talked about stables as this monolithic thing, like digital cash, right? But if you know anything about stables, you can have USDC on 12 chains, right? And you go, oh, well, you know, as Javier said, in the regulated version of the future, you're like, wait a sec, like, which chains are regulated? Where the assets live? Like, there's a whole bunch of like nuance to all of this that you really need to get into if you're going to fulfill the regulatory mandates that you have. And my experience there was not a lot of sophistication about how this stuff actually works. And then the world that I live in, CDBCs are like a punchline. They're a joke. Hey, look, they're being banned. Does anyone know who Finality is? I had never heard of this company before, okay? Finality, no I, in Finality, they're like this super well-respected, I talked to many people who were like, Finality nailed it. And you know what they do? They do on-chain sterling. It's not dollars. It's not euros. It's pound sterling, okay? And they've been this little company that started out tiny and went through working with the Bank of England. And by the way, we like to talk about the US banking system and the European banking system. Well, it's a tripartite group, and the third is the UK. And these guys are the furthest ahead. And there's actually this sort of very interesting process where if you go through the step of getting to be able to issue, I'm not sure the total nuances was explained to me, to be able to issue a digital currency in the UK, you issue it at this teeny-weeny level that's totally useless for this purpose. It's like pennies, effectively. But then every year you're in existence, they raise it, and they raise it, and they raise it. And so these guys have been around long enough that they actually have enough to be meaningful, and every year they get bigger. And it doesn't matter who you are, what bank you are or where, if you're going to compete with them, you're going to start out with pennies. So they have this head start that's basically insurmountable. And of course, they're already talking about, well, pretty soon we're going to be in euros, and then we're going to be in dollars, or maybe the vice versa. And so everyone was talking about Finality, right? And again, that's a CDBC, right? And so in our world in the US, CDBCs are a joke. In many other parts of the world, they're not at all, and they're very much part of this ecosystem. Who was there? So this is a grandiose event, 10,000 people, very elaborate, very fancy, and it's interesting. There are it's huge, spread out. Literally, there's like this app that you use, and inside the app is a contest of who can go the most steps. And you hang out there, you're like, oh yeah, I probably do 20,000 steps while I'm there. And there's 2 show floors, both quite large. The top floor is like all the member banks. Like that's the floor of prestige. That's where Swift has like this giant booth, the biggest booth overall. But you might imagine all the usual suspects, JP Morgan, Bank of China, Wells Fargo, all big booths upstairs. Big tech is there. Microsoft, IBM, Google was a sponsor. They didn't have a booth. Red Hat, others. And you go, well, where's big crypto? And literally, booths on the floor, there were exactly 4. And 3 of them were downstairs. Blockdaemon had a booth, Fireblocks had a booth, OKX had a booth, and Chainlink, okay? Chainlink was the only one upstairs, and Chainlink was kitty corner to the Swift booth. And this is, you can't really see, but there's Sergey right there. By far, of any crypto entity, Chainlink had by far the biggest presence. And one of the things that I learned was actually Chainlink was born out of a Swift conference. So there, you know, if you go to crypto things, you don't see, at least in my experience, you haven't seen a lot of Chainlink. They're not super active in the Ethereum community, et cetera. But they're very visible and very active in this community. But on stage, there were a lot of interesting people. Joe Lubin from Consensus was there. Paxos was there. A bunch of other folks were on stage. And there's that. But, you know, if you knew what to look for, there were a few interesting people. This is a guy named David Walsh, who runs enterprise for the Ethereum Foundation. Okay, so there were a few of us running around. But one of the things that I realized was, while digital assets and these rails were a big theme of Sibos, our industry was not really represented there. And in fact, how they talk about us is quite a bit different. Now, this is a little interesting, like a real-time poll. Are stablecoins a solid bet for reducing FX settlement risks? Now, if you're in this room, you're like, of course, like, yeah, duh, right? Like they're the foreign exchange, absolutely. 53% of the audience said, maybe, right? Depends on regulation infrastructure development, right? Only 20% said, yes, stablecoins are part of the solution. Again, you're sitting there, you're going, what world are we in here? What are you guys? But this is the world of financial. This is the world of the incumbents, of the status quo. Yes, stablecoins are a solution. No, other solutions are more important, CDBCs, linked RTPs, et cetera, right? And so again, things that seem very common sense to those of us in this room are not necessarily common sense on the other end. Well, how real is this? I mean, is this slideware? Is this happy? These are pictures that I took of a small workshop led by this little company called Oracle. Maybe you've heard of them. And they do a lot of the back office stuff. So here they're talking about, basically correspondent routing. So you're trying to complete an international transaction. There are these various routes that they go through, and each route has a different profile, cost, time, et cetera, and you're trying to optimize the route. And from them, they're like, oh yeah, crypto. Like crypto will just be another route, right? And here they're like, cryptocurrency, key characteristics of payment transactions, and if you were to be able to read through this, which you can't, like perfectly, got it all, nailed, totally makes sense. Here are cryptocurrency use cases. They lay out a bunch of use cases. Here's an example, cross-border payment across SWIFT and stablecoin rails with crypto in between. Here is their actual UI. Cross-border across stablecoin rails where you specify all this stuff. And then even more so, AI-based intelligent routing enables optimal correspondent path selection. And this little bit over here is a crypto bit, okay? And so for me, I was like, oh, this is super real. This is not happy horseshit. This is not chatty. This is very thoughtful, very thorough, very integrated, and yet our whole world that we think is going to take over their world is just like some corner of a slide, okay? Oh yeah, it's just over here. It's just like one thing, right? And so this is the other piece that I think what's happening in that world, at least my takeaway, was the world of Web3, crypto, digital assets, however you want to say it, is now accepted as it's real, it's here, and we're going to incorporate it. And that's kind of it. Like it's not, oh my gosh, it's not we're reinventing everything. It's not we're moving our existing workloads over there. It's like, oh yeah, and then there's crypto too, okay? Oh, by the way, it wasn't just Oracle. This is this other little software company you may have heard of called NASDAQ, okay? This was in their booth to say how to connect to blockchain rails. So Calypso is their backend infrastructure. The blue is Calypso. The green is a blockchain network. And again, you can't really read that, but in this case, it was this little network called Canton that Pat already talked about that you guys are involved in. Bridging TradFi and DeFi for capital markets. Crypto is this little bit down here. Right? That's the whole crypto bit. And tokenized collateral management. By the way, there's a ton more. I have millions and millions of these slides of me just sort of sitting there talking to folks and realizing, oh, they're coming, okay? And I think the thing that I really come away with was it's happening. It's happening in ways that are like so much bigger than we can anticipate, and yet we're a little corner of it from their world. And also, how they think about what we do is quite a bit different than how what we think about what we do, and there's a lot of room for further engagement, where members of our ecosystem can engage with members of their ecosystem, and what I hope for is that future Syboses and similar events, there will be many more of us there, okay? So alignment is key because they view our world very differently, and representation is key, but if you're wondering like which way it's going, which way the wind's blowing, it's blowing forward, okay? So with that, thank you very much. I'm Matt, and thanks for having me. Cheers, everybody.